All right, welcome back to MGD 111. Another tool I want to show you here is the Paint Bucket tool. Now this one's pretty cool. Here we are in Photoshop. The Paint Bucket tool is not usually visible in your toolbar. Look for this one here that looks like it's fading from black to white. That's our gradation tool or gradient tool. We'll study that one a little bit later in the semester. But for some reason behind that is the Paint Bucket tool. And I'm not sure why they put those together because they really don't relate in any way. But let's see what this does, shall we? Well, I have my foreground color of red. If I just click in the sky, and by the way, it used to be, this kind of drives me nuts, see how the bucket has paint coming out of it? It used to be that you put the tip of the paint where you wanted it to go, and it would paint there. Now it has that little arrow next to it, and that arrow is what marks it. If you've never used this program before, it's just fine. But if you've been using it for years, this will drive you nuts for a while until you're used to it. So I'm going to click with this arrow here up in the sky and oh my gosh, it filled it with red. What happened here? Well, like before, it's our foreground color. Okay, that's all well and good. But why did it fill in like this? Well, there's several features up here in the control bar that tell us what's going on. First of all, we don't have to use the foreground. We could use a pattern. I'm not going to mess with that, but we can use the foreground color or some sort of pattern if we had one. We'll cover that in a later issue or later lesson. We can also control the opacity too. I'm going to hit undo. I'm going to make the opacity say 50%. Watch what happens when I click up there. You'll notice it filled the same spot, but it didn't fill it with that density. If I click on this white building down here, you'll notice it still allows the details to show through. So we can control the opacity, and that's a fairly new feature for the Paint Bucket, actually. It's kind of cool. But the most important thing here is the tolerance. What tolerance does, there's two tools that use tolerance. There's the Paint Bucket and there's the Magic Wand, which we'll cover in another lesson. But the higher the tolerance, the more it's accepting of other colors. The lower the tolerance, the less accepting it is of other colors. What does that mean exactly? Well, if I were to, say, click on this yellow here, you notice it covered a bunch of the yellow, but for some of this yellow, it didn't seem to go for it. Why is that? Well, it's just kind of a different shade. So it's not tolerating the difference between this yellow and that yellow. But if I increase that tolerance, let's make it, it goes from 0 to 100. Let's make it 75 and click in the same spot. You'll notice it filled in a much larger area. So it was more tolerant of the changes there. In fact, if I set it to 100%, oops, it fills up a gigantic area, including things that weren't even remotely close to that color. So we have to be kind of careful with that. Opposite effect if we go with a lower number. Let's pick maybe 10 instead of, we started with 32. If I click on it, it's only going to cover a very small range. And what it's doing too is it's selecting where I just clicked plus all of the connected pixels that fall within that range. Now I can also, let me undo that, I'm going to set my tolerance to 32. That's the default. It's always good to start with 32 and see what it does. I'm going to turn off the contiguous, and what that does is it selects all the colors within that picture, and they don't even have to be connected. So it says, okay, anything in this photo that's within that range, even if it's not touching, it's going to connect. Sometimes that's a great thing, sometimes it's not. So just make sure that you're using contiguous or not. Contiguous, notice it captures that part of the blue. Non-contiguous, captures a whole bunch of blue. There are pros and cons to both settings there, so that's kind of a cool thing. Yeah, the tolerance setting takes some practice to get used to as far as how to set it just right. Again, start with 32 and see what it does. It may be that it's too much or not enough. And you can also just go around the picture and keep clicking on more areas and it'll continue to fill it in. Now this may not seem like a very practical tool, but if you use it just right, let's say I wanted to change this blue building to a green building. If I were to select the right color green, select the right opacity, select just the right tolerance, make it non-contiguous, it would fill in that shade of blue with a new color. So it's a very useful tool. It's not a very precise tool, though, in that it sometimes doesn't give you the effect that you want. In fact, the harder the edges are on things, the more it gives you these weird little anomalies like that. But it's a useful tool, so get used to playing with how that works. Thanks and enjoy.